Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We Can Be Heroes, AusCERT 2020, going virtual. Adam Spence with you, your MC, again for this afternoon session. Hope you had yourselves a fantastic time during the morning and lunch break. Hope you got to check out a few of the sponsors, a few of the parallel streams and the like. We've got three great presentations coming at you this afternoon. First one is from a highly proficient security professional, a man previously responsible for the technical direction and leadership of one of the world's largest technical security consultancies. He now heads up corporate security at SEEK. He's worked with some of the world's largest banks and financial organizations, with federal, state, local governments. He's presented and organized a number of security conferences and helped mentor the next generation of security professionals. During his presentation, if there's anything you want to ask, just hit us up in the A column, and if time permits, I'll ask a couple of those questions at the end of the session, presented by the one and only, take it away, Lukasz Gogolkiewicz.
All right, thank you. Greetings from Melbourne, everyone. Lockdown central of Australia, as we all know, being down here. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the nations throughout Australia, and in particular, the traditional owners in Melbourne, where I live, the Wurundjeri people, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. I would also like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I'd like to kick it off with a little bit of a story, and this one involves one of my next door neighbours. She lives a few doors down, and she had a mum coming around to her house to deliver some groceries, and she walks past this gentleman and just doesn't bat an eyelid, looks like anyone else. And she goes to the gate and she looks at this person out the corner of her eye, hovering around a car, and she turns full frontal to him and just looks at him. And here he is looking inside a car, looking very, very, very suspicious. So he looks at her, looks inside the car, looks at her again, and then he picks up a little paver at the front of our house and just goes, whoop, smashes the window, and then he reaches inside, grabs the handbag, and just like nothing ever happened, casually ever so, just strolls away. And then she's there thinking, with these shopping bags in hand, what do I do? This is crazy. I would be thinking, where do you live? But, you know, we've seen these types of crimes happen a lot. So a little bit about me. Some of you may know me, some of you may not. I've been around the AusCERT scene for a few years now, and I've been helping out with chairing some of the tracks. And when Beck asked and reached out to do a keynote presentation, I was absolutely over the moon and excited. So obviously I said yes, because I'm here. So I've been around the world and doing this security thing. And in Australia, I have been here as well for a little while. And during that time, I've broken into many companies, either from a physical standpoint or from a virtual standpoint. So I've broken into some really, really cool places. And that could be telecommunications companies, that could be banks, that could be insurance companies, that could be critical infrastructure, government buildings, and data centers, all legally, of course, because the companies wanted me to do that. And I've also broken into some very boring and mundane places as well. And what did all those places have in common, you might ask? They're all compliant. They're all compliant to some sort of standard, some sort of governance framework, but ultimately they're all compliant. And they're all certified, accredited, or follow some kind of security standard. And you know, this is not an exhaustive list or an indicative list of what they were actually compliant to. However, it is a list of the certifications and bodies we do have around the world, and each with a very similar approach, or maybe, you know, a slightly different approach, but fundamentally they're all there to potentially secure their assets. So one big thing that I've noticed in the past few years, and this is something I've been thinking about, you know, for the past 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 years, is that security does not, compliance rather, does not actually equal security. So this is why I wanted to do this talk, and this is something I have been thinking about for a while, and it really stemmed from 2 key times. And the first one is managing and running a lot of the pen testing companies I have in the past, my career, and being on a lot of those teams as well. There's always this sense of regret and frustration from a lot of security professionals when they get a customer respond to one of their reports, or a prospective customer come up to them and say, hey, we want to do a pen test. It's just a compliance activity, so don't worry about it. And every single pen tester always says, again, another compliance activity. I'm going to find the same things I did last quarter. It's always these issues. They never fix it. Something that has happened, a few times in the past as well, it'll be a customer needing to test their PCI environment or their compliant environment, and they will be spending, over $100,000 on this type of assessment just because they had to do it. And these are some of the conversations I've had with my clients, and some of you out there might recall me having this conversation with you, saying we've got to do something a little bit better than this. Why don't we actually deliver a lot of security into your organization? But ultimately, it always came back down to, well, we have to tick that box. We have to be compliant. So in this research, I found, numerous articles, numerous white papers, numerous YouTubes, all that kind of thing. And this quote kind of really, really stood out for me. And it was from Frances Dewing, and it was only a couple of years ago. So she said, compliance was meant to be a floor, but it has become a ceiling, because a lot of companies, in my opinion, use compliance as the bare minimum of what they have to do in order to get that next contract or satisfy the entry criteria for a negotiation. Not all compliance standards, frameworks, are necessarily bad. They do really serve their purpose. However, we need to really have a look at the actual problem that they solve. So compliance has fundamentally not really kept up with today's problems. You have PCI DSS, which was created, 15 or so years ago by Visa. And over that time, it's gone through a few iterations, but fundamentally, the industry has gone this way, and the threats have gone a completely opposite way. I'd like to also mention the threat landscape has significantly changed also since PCI was created. 15 years ago, between now and 15 years ago, there wasn't really a cloud, really. So the goalposts have definitely moved. So I know as security professionals and those who present in these types of forums always like to mention, lessons learned from the past, and what do all of these companies also have in common? They've all suffered a targeted breach, some kind of major attack or security incidents in the past few years, or 3 or 4 years, and always the vector of attack has largely varied. So you take PageUp, for example, the information that I was given, that it was a misconfiguration issue, and it was not really a breach, but more of an incident. So some data was somewhere where it shouldn't have been. Capital One, the data was hosted on a public Git page, and the cause was believed to be some sort of insider threat. Target, we always pick on Target because they're a good target. Despite being PCI compliant, they lost a significant number of credit card information just during a conventional antivirus mechanism, and ultimately certain processes and procedures weren't followed. The external party didn't identify as, just had potentially alert fatigue and just didn't really click on and investigate the right type of alert when they suspected it may or may not have been an attack. The other one around was a Neiman Marcus, was again around 2014, and that breach is identified by a whole bunch of payment cards that were used fraudulently, and that was ultimately linked back to Neiman Marcus. So they didn't actually identify that they were breached as other people going to them, and also that was potentially a malware attack, it was believed at the time. Then again in 2015, they were targeted with an attack which left 5,200 people's personal information out there and exposed because someone was brute forcing username and passwords on one of their login screens. And then today we had a brilliant presentation from Brian Hay and Laurie Joyce talking through the Australian blood bank breach. And so although there was The compromises absolutely varied, and there was a combination of potential insider threats, advanced malware with advanced techniques to bypass conventional antivirus detections, which is not really something that's usually looked at during some sort of compliance assessment. Password reuse is very difficult to identify during these types of assessments as well, and misconfigurations of public-facing infrastructure. So what do all these companies have in common as well? Again, they're all certified or had some kind of accreditation. And the message of these frameworks ultimately is, like, are they actually required or not? Are they outdated? Are they a waste of time? I like to think not necessarily, but as I'll go into later in this presentation, I think we need to kind of push the bounds a little bit further. Now, I know what you're here for. It's statistics and figures, and not just my brand new COVID figure. But compliance requirements and assessments are on a rise, and they're still increasing. The Verizon 2020 breach report indicated that there is an increasing number of breaches happening in certain sectors or certain areas, and largely it's around web applications are standing out, and there's some misconfigurations as well. If you have a look at the Accenture report around the cost of cybercrime, it's indicated that, you know, last year there's been an increase of around 12% of the cost of cybercrime, and overall 72% in the last 5. And then again, the number of security breaches increased by about 11% in the last year, and 67 overall in the past 5. So, you know, it's looking like it's on the rise. But also when you kind of dig a little bit deeper into something a little bit closer to home, the notifiable data breach report from the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner indicates that this year, only this year, it's dropped by about 3% since the start of the year. And this could be due to a number of things, right? We don't really have enough data to kind of deep dive into the root cause of the drop. My personal suspicion is that potentially a lot of us in the defensive space, a lot of us in the IT space, a lot of the sysadmin space have all been centered and focused around the COVID problem, and maybe didn't spend as much time as we should have, or had enough time, and there's only 24 hours in a day, on actually the potential security and breach problem. So the argument really is the compliance is growing up, the breaches are going up, so what can we do? So I'd like to kind of show you a bit of a problem and a trend of what the results for compliance is for a lot of us, right? So I'm probably preaching to the converted a lot of ways, because you know, it's likely organizations are going to be targeted, and it's probably not going to be exploiting an SSL issue. I like to quote Metalstorm here somewhat, but I've broken into a lot of banks. I've broken into a lot of, you know, startups as well, and it's never ever been for TLS or SSL issues. And this is fundamentally a problem. You know, they might be targeting web applications and misconfigurations as indicated in the report, and that's what we should be actually focusing on. So the issue here is, if you have a look at that screenshot there, is this is what happens in a vulnerability management process. The internal team gets inundated with all these issues, and I'd like to kind of have a look into sometime maybe how many of these breaches were because the analysts or the security engineering team spent a lot of their time triaging and fixing issues that weren't really issues. So what's the solution for next door neighbor? If we kind of go about it potentially from a compliance-driven model and go down the path that all cars must have some kind of security controls, will we all be driving around bulletproof vehicles? Will we all be having to put additional locks on our cars as well to ensure that our valuables are stored and are safe? Maybe we'll just chain them up to a tree and make sure that, you know, the car doesn't get stolen as well as our other valuables inside it as well? Or do we actually need to consider things a little bit more broadly? So what's the solution potentially from a compliance-driven approach? And that could be potentially a threat-driven approach, which I'm about to go into. And I'd kind of like to take a bit of a side note around having some time and actually investigating this and researching this presentation. I'm not trying to pick on any vendors here. I think they definitely do solve a lot of problems by having a lot of really good tools and a lot of really good fixes. But I think there are a lot of mixed messages, and potentially some of those messages are ultimately not really helping us as an industry, and potentially their clients actually uplifting their security posture. So some of the messages, and I'll paraphrase, I want to kind of pick on any specific vendors here, but one of them stated, how do you stop information security incidents? The answer is in the standard. Find out everything you need to know to protect your organization from breaches by implementing the ISO 27001 standard. Perhaps you need more penetration testing to find all the vulnerabilities. Perhaps you need a bug bounty program. What about a web application firewall? And I've personally been in the room where something like that has been said in the past, where post-assessment, a vendor indicated that all their problems could be solved by implementing a web application firewall. And we all know that that's fundamentally not entirely accurate. Or there might be some kind of scare tactics. You could be liable for $100,000 a month if you're found to be non-compliant. And another little story I kind of say that I was chatting to a friend of mine in industry, a peer, and he was indicating around a red team that he recently did. And like all red teamers, my previous role as a red teamer, you get quite excited about it because they're really, really fun breaking into places and getting paid for it. So he was describing this red team, and I was querying him on all the ins and outs, and what was your vector of attack? How'd you get in? What'd you do? Laterally move? How did you bypass these controls? And all those kind of things, right? To kind of learn off that. And ultimately, what was done was the implantation of a physical device into an organization. And I was curious, like how plant a device? Did you query it there, or did you kind of, ask someone to plug it in or something like that via social engineering means? And the result was, no, I physically broke in. Okay. And in my mind, I'm thinking that's really cool. And it's a really cool story for the pub. I have plenty of stories around how I broke in to many places physically and bypassed security or jumped a turnstile or whatever. But ultimately, what's the threat model? Like, who is actually likely to break into an organization which, unless you're the government, unless you're really holding really top secret stuff for, or potentially a vaccine for COVID-19, the real threats are probably not going to be from a physical approach. So I like to kind of move into what the threat-driven model approach is, and maybe relate it to something that we might all be kind of used to at the moment, or familiar with rather. So Lockheed Martin have a really good white paper, and the link is down bottom of the slide there, so hopefully you can see that. And this book has components of it. I didn't kind of rip off all their really hard work, and I do thoroughly encourage you to have a look through and have a think about what their approach is and if it's appropriate for your company. But here we have a typical approach. You have security on the left. You have, like, this is representative of most businesses. You have operations, response, security on the left. You have architecture, engineering on the right. And then you have this massive wall between the two where you just get problems kind of thrown from one side of the fence to the other. And this might look very, very familiar. It took me far too long to create that animation. But essentially what happens is you have this ping pong effect, or pong effect rather, if I want to use the reference correctly. And you have the problem kind of thrown back and forth. So there's a security assessment. Because we have to do compliance, let's throw it over there. It's an engineering problem, fix up your problems, and then it comes back for the next round of testing, the next quarter, the next year, 2 years later. And that's what we see time and time again. And so it's a never-ending process. And at the same time, what can potentially happen is ultimately someone makes a mistake, someone misses something, and you have an incident. So let's have a look at the potential threat-driven approach, right? And this is what we want to do, is move the barriers outside and join the two teams together. So what we want to do is have, on the left-hand side, you have some very, very gifted, highly specialized, highly motivated, security people with, incredible backgrounds. And these people, what they want to do is do security stuff, do cyber stuff. And what we really need is to listen to these people. And a lot of the best kind of intelligence and the best kind of security advice you're going to get is most likely from internal security folk. They know the layout of the land, right? So what we need to do, and these people are plugged in to what's going on in the community. They attend conferences like AusCERT, like all the other conferences around the world. We're going virtual now as well, so it makes it a lot easier to attend a lot more and get access to a lot more knowledge. They know the threat landscape. They know what's happening out there. They know the latest, attack that's targeting a lot of the domain controllers at the moment, right? So they can inform the architecture and engineering team saying, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is what we're seeing out there. And then the architecture team rather can take that information in, feed that into the design process, work with the engineering team, uplift the tools and the infrastructure as code, or even the legacy applications into what's actually most likely to target them, and then feed that back with new patterns and architecture. So ultimately what you do is you uplift the security posture by having a more informed decision of who is actually likely to target you, how they're likely to target you, where they're likely to target you, instead of just bouncing that ball back and forth from a compliance-driven approach. All right, so back to our example, or our analogy rather. How can we use this in a practical sense, right? And I like to kind of use, and this is why this analogy is perfect, and I feel sorry for my neighbor, but I'm definitely glad that I knew the story. So if we kind of approach it from a threat-driven approach, and this is something that you'll all be very familiar with, we have insurance companies and members of the public all complaining to law enforcement and government officials saying, hey, this is an increased problem. This is happening. We're seeing it in the InfoSec world. We're getting breached. This is happening. And the end result is there's vandalism, there's additional costs, there's people being out of pocket, insurance companies having to pay out of their pocket, people having to pay out of their pocket. And then ultimately it's stolen property, which kind of fuels the crime gangs that might be around, right? And the police take that information on and they say, okay, well, let's build up a map. Where's this happening? When is it happening? And then what you get, they have an idea and understanding of, hey, we know the threat landscape. We know the crime that's going on around the communities. And we can build up little hotspots and say, well, you know what? This area of Melbourne, my area of Melbourne, this crime is actually quite prevalent. So why don't we do something about it? And we've seen this in real world, right? We've seen all these signs floating around saying, hey, make sure when you step out of your vehicle, you lock up your car and take all your valuables with you, or at least hide them, right? So you can lock your car, take your keys, hide your stuff, or fill your purse with decoy angry bees. And ultimately, we need to go back to that compliance example and saying, well, all cars must have these controls as a very blanket approach, right? So why don't we just highlight the areas that we know are most likely to get targeted, and then implement some kind of threat-driven approach to security, physical security in this example, and maybe cybersecurity in our example. So this is a very clever use of threat intelligence. And just as a side note, my other neighbor is a tradesperson, and he has a ute, and he had his tools stolen off the back of his ute. And there's a lot of works going on around my area currently. And whenever I see a worker out there, I'll say, hey, just a heads up, mate. There are people targeting tradies at the moment. They're stealing tools. Just be mindful of that, of not having extremely valuable tools out in the wild or out on the tray of your ute. And they say thanks, and I just kind of move on. So kind of moving back to the overall threat-driven approach, and I do strongly encourage you to have a read of that white paper. I've kind of taken bits and pieces from it and kind of concatenated with things that I've seen and that I've kind of experienced. And it isn't just a security problem. It's something. It's not a compliance problem either. It's something that everyone needs to consider more broadly as well. And it's architecture teams, it's internal teams. I know I'm, beating the drum that we're all kind of trying to beat all the time. But hey, it's not just us that needs to kind of do all these things. But what you need to do as an internal team, and one that's responsible for defending your businesses and your organizations, is have a look at what is your mission? Like fundamentally, what are you trying to achieve, right? There might be various companies. So you might be in finance, you have certain things you want to ensure that they don't happen. And this is what I did when I was in the consultancy world on the offensive side of things, is I frequently asked, whenever we were engaged to perform an assessment, what is the worst case scenario? Have you had incidents in the past? Who is likely to target you? Do you know, or do you don't know? And companies potentially know these things because they've had incidents. They've had either operational incidents or security incidents, but there's always been this level of, was that operational incident a DDoS attack or something else, right? And this is what really drives that conversation for you to help identify the very, very important points around the how and the why of a potential threat actor. You really need to know those points. And then ultimately, what you want to do is move into address the other aspects of it. And there have been times where I've been on site at a client, or talking to one of my clients, or one of my team members or colleagues or peers in the field have been talking to clients, and they always say, and you're probably all going to say, I've said that before, oh, don't touch that system. We know it's vulnerable. We don't want to test it. It might fall over. Or it's like, yeah, we just know it's been around forever. It's going to get decommissioned in 6 months, 12 months, however long. That is the problem. That is fundamentally a problem, because that addresses the why, or the where rather. So where are threat actors likely to target you? That is where you're going to get popped or compromised. You're not going to get compromised by, pen testing the latest and greatest implementation of something that you have. And ultimately, you have to have it driven as a threat model, right? So if someone's internally, they're most likely going to compromise and go down the easiest course. So the process it should be around continuous feedback. Your teams should be working together, because ultimately historically you've had compliance pulling you to this direction, and you've had the security aspect of things pulling you in that direction of what you need to do to secure your organization. So I'd like to kind of go through a little bit of a process. I've got a little bit of time left. So ultimately, what you want to do is develop a package that's known good, right? Put that to the side. Develop an application that uses a package, put some security controls around it, assess it, go through a threat modeling aspect or exercise. That application is in a known good state. Put that on an operating system. That operating system will be in a known good state after you go through the same process as well. And then you go down to the network level and repeat. Then you have to the side a package that's on an application, that's on an operating system, that's in a network, that's all in a good state. So the end result is that your contribution to that IT infrastructure or to the ecosystem is going to be a lot less, because you're already introducing it into an ecosystem that's already in a good state. So with all that said, what are some of the key takeaways? And I chatted to some friends and colleagues and peers in the industry around this specific topic, and tried to get their understanding of the issue and their perspective as well. And one of them said something very apt. It says, no attacker will view the compliance tick on your website and move to another target. Just like no attacker is going to look at your laptop on the front seat and potentially not break the window and steal it. And we've seen this from many breaches, right? It's increasing, the compliance is increasing, the attack breaches are increasing, and they're probably just not going to stop. And how much visibility does your compliance actually provide? This is the question you really need to fundamentally ask. And I'm not saying I'm going to change it overnight, saying, hey, push back, I'm not going to do ISO anymore. I'm just saying have a think about these things. And we need to really ask the question whether or not compliance is actually addressing the security risk of the organization, like who's actually likely to target the company, or is it just a checkbox approach that is really providing a potential false sense of security? Ultimately, what you need to do is just go further than just ticking that box. Work with your vendors. If you do outsource your security, work with them and push them to uplift your security as a result as well. And what you really want to do is don't stop at the ceiling, push for what's next. Like, again, work with the vendors. Compliance does have its place, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say we should abolish all sorts of compliance, but just have a security conversation, and it should not stop there. The other point I would like to say is you should really invest in your people or your heroes, because most likely they ultimately know exactly where the threats are. And just coming from an experience perspective of the amount of sysadmins I've talked to, and I'll say, hey, if you're pen testing, have a look at that. I've been asking for that for 12 months, for 18 months, for 24 months. And ultimately, nothing changes until you get that report that says there's a compliance risk because this is not fixed. And I've seen a few presentations today, and we're all kind of going the same direction, where you need to invest in your people, because they do possess that very, very specific mindset. They do have a very specific approach, and these people all invest a lot of their time and energy into this area of cybersecurity that we're all in, and they live and breathe it, right? And we need to also invite people that are in the non-security area into forums like this and get them involved into the discussion as well. Thank you very much. And I'd like to have just a special thanks to some of the people that kind of helped me in the past week or so to kind of get this thing started. Thanks.
Great stuff, Lucas. Thank you very much. People are loving it. I saw on the chat they in particular like the animated Pong PowerPoint. You said you spent a lot of time getting that together. How long did that take to nail down, mate?
I had to YouTube how to do PowerPoints appropriately for security professionals, and you want to see the animation again. So yeah, it took far too long. It was like an hour or two of just like, what went this thing? Anyway, I'm not good at PowerPoints.
One quick question. This position you've got here, wanting to raise the ceiling and move beyond mere compliance, is this a distinctly minority view, or do you think a lot of your security brothers and sisters are on the same page as you?
I think everyone's on the same page, but like I had in that slide before of that Twitter screenshot, everyone's just inundated with a lot of that stuff coming through, right? They're just so bogged down. And to be honest, if you only have budget for one person to look at security for your organization, which might be 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, and that person all of a sudden has to address all of those risks or perceived risks from a compliance standpoint, they're not actually fundamentally addressing a lot of the risks that are actually going to be facing a lot of these environments and businesses.
Bring up the single question we got most on the Q&A, got upvoted to 4 total votes. It's Lucas, are you married? ?
Am I married? Yes, I am.
Right. I was going to say, getting knocked up all the way. Getting knocked up all the way up to 4 is a very, in fact, it's gone up to 5 right now.
There we go.
7, it's now the most, 10 to 11, 12. Okay, here we go. We're in a bit of trouble here. We've got the gala dinner coming up tonight, mate. I'd be very careful if I was you. Thanks a lot for your time, Lucas. Lucas is going to head down to level 4. You want to continue the conversation or ask something more technical, Lucas will be down on level 4, and there's currently 63 people have upvoted the Lucas. Are you?
I don't want to go there now.
I've created
it's not on Tinder.
Thank you very much, Lucas. It is 20 past 3 here at AusCERT 2020. I just did a time call like I'm on breakfast radio. I don't know why. I'm loving the chat. I'm loving some of the stuff I'm seeing there. Ben, for example, noticed I was wearing a different shirt to what I was in the morning session. And on the chat line, he contributed costume change. This is almost as exciting as Eurovision. And Ben then followed that up with, quote, I'll take a shot if he manages a key change, end quote. Now, Ben, I would never encourage drinking during keynote sessions, but Ben, if you're listening, here is your key change. I'm doing this out of a friend's office in a meeting room, and I just got a very strange look from the woman at reception. Okay,